Hi everyone, Kevin from Total Endurance here. I've just put together some slides on kind of some data that we've got from a runner. I thought it was going to be quite interesting, certainly heading into the winter with people thinking about kind of spring marathons and starting to think about training and setting some goals for next year. So this is around, can I run a sub 3:30 marathon? Not me personally, it's from someone else's data, so it's just showing what that data tells us, what that runner ultimately needs to do, and giving some kind of actionable data that they can use to then ultimately improve, which I think is the most important thing, is then taking the data and then being able to apply it to training to then improve to ultimately achieve the goal. So the runner that we're using here is a female runner. Weight was 65 kilos, and we do the kind of fairly standard test that we do, the two parts of it. Test 1, max ramp test, starting at 4 kilometers per hour. Basically, we're increasing the speed every minute, going up by 1 kilometer per hour until that runner hits fatigue. And then we give them a rest, come back on. We do the second test where we do 5 times 4 minutes between aerobic and anaerobic thresholds. So we're basically testing kind of endurance and kind of sustainable paces. So that's for a runner that's kind of pace they can maintain for quite a long time, up till about their 10k pace. We tend not to go for the 4 minutes, we tend not to go above 10k pace, because we tend to see that they're predominantly using more and more anaerobic systems when you go sort of above that 10k pace. So anaerobic threshold is usually about as fast as you want to go for a test where you're looking at efficiency and economy. And from that, we get, from the first test, we get that VO2 max, we get aerobic threshold, anaerobic thresholds. We can effectively use that for training zones, but then the second part, using the first part to get the second part, we can then look at, well, how efficient are they relative to VO2 max and thresholds? How good are they using fat for fuel? How efficient are they at converting oxygen to being able to run? So this particular runner, from the first test, VO2 max 55.8. That's pretty good. Female athletes, anything over sort of mid-50s is generally good. Obviously, getting into elites, they're kind of 60, 65, high 60s. But yeah, 55.8 for an amateur is generally pretty good and shows good kind of aerobic capacity. With a velocity at VO2 max, so the speed where VO2 max kind of occurred was sort of 320 per kilometer, so 18k an hour. So there's good speed there. The runner's relatively fast, or able to run relatively fast. And then what we've got here is anaerobic threshold. So anaerobic threshold, the saying, is about 10k pace for most people. It's roughly the intensity you could run for 30 to 60 minutes. It's about that threshold pace where fatigue sets in exponentially, so we start to kind of correlate it reasonably well with lactate term point, but we're not using lactate terms for this particular one. It's ventilatory threshold. The 81% is what some we call fractional utilization of VO2 max. So that's how much of your VO2 max, how much of your capacity are you capable of using. So 81% at anaerobic threshold is quite good. 90% is the kind of upper sort of ceiling for most people. So there's definitely room for this particular runner to improve it. And their threshold sort of pace, their velocity at threshold was 14k an hour, so roughly 417 per k, and that correlates quite well, I think, with what their sort of 10k PB was, you know, around about that kind of 42 minutes, somewhere between 40 and 42 minutes. So the aerobic threshold, was 67% of VO2 max, so we see that they're using 67% of the VO2 max at the aerobic threshold. The aerobic threshold is that first ventilatory point where we see breathing rate change, where we would see conversational pace start to become difficult. It's what we would define as being kind of where we intersect going from zone 2 to zone 3. So where we should be predominantly doing most of our endurance training at. And for this runner, it was roughly 11k an hour and about 5:27 per kilometer. So now that we've got this, we've got a good kind of benchmark of the athlete. We know, pretty good. But the thing that stands out is the capacity is pretty good, and the kind of 2 thresholds below that definitely could be improved. So the ceiling's quite high, but the 2 thresholds, the 2 floors below, need a little bit of work to develop. Certainly a jump out from that. And just kind of show something about like how that data kind of looks. This is a theoretical calculated demand of oxygen. So this is how much oxygen is theoretically needed for each of these velocities. So this is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute on the left hand side, with minutes per kilometer on the x-axis. And this is basically the calculated demand using the ASTM kind of fairly standard calculation for oxygen versus pace, so it also takes into account gradient as well. So you can calculate what would be the increase in oxygen to go up an incline as well. And it gives just a good rough outline of, right, this is how much oxygen is theoretically needed, how much oxygen does the individual runner actually need. And when we plot that on here, where we look at the oxygen uptake, so the blue, or the light blue here, is the actual oxygen that was consumed by the runner through the ramp test. And what we can see here is, as they started at sort of 4 kilometers per hour, went a little bit faster, 5, 6. We see that this is probably where they started running, just at 6 kilometers per hour. We see there's a big change in demand, but they're able to meet the demand quite comfortably. So fairly, what you tend to see at these lower speeds or below aerobic threshold is the body is capable of meeting the demand quite easily. So the two lines should be fairly parallel together. But we start to see for this particular runner, kind of at that 6, certainly up into like 5:27, we start to see that gap open. And that gap opening is an indicator that there's slightly more energy going to come anaerobically. So it's not just all aerobic work now. And we can plot that with the first threshold. That aerobic threshold correlates pretty much bang on where we see that point start to drift across. So where we see the anaerobic system is starting to contribute a little bit more than it did previously. So up until that point, it was 99.9% aerobic work. And as we exceed that, we start to need a little bit more energy through the anaerobic pathways. We start to rely a little bit more glycolysis. We start to see carbohydrates being utilized a little bit more. And again, we can plot the anaerobic threshold. So this is where we see the second sort of where there's a bigger drift off again. When we see that kind of open out a bit more, that's a good indicator that the body is now starting to struggle to meet the oxygen demand. We're starting to rely slightly more heavily on the anaerobic system. That's partly where we'd see kind of lactate start to accumulate at that point there as well, just because we can't quite get the oxygen through the system quick enough. We can still get more oxygen in, but we're not capable of utilizing it, so the body's not as efficient anymore. So we have to start breaking down kind of carbohydrates. We start to have to use anaerobic system a little bit quicker to get the energy through quick enough. And then from that, we get to the point where we cap the ceiling, where there's no more oxygen coming into the system. So that's where we effectively reach our potential. Now, VO2 max can always be up to a point improved. It's usually capped once we get to kind of older ages. We tend to see it sort of increases less, but it can still be improved. Even sometimes what happens is, even if the oxygen doesn't go up, we can learn to run faster at VO2 max. So for this runner, you might get to 19, 20k an hour for about the same oxygen from that. And that's usually a strength thing as well. They get stronger, they can actually maintain the speed by using less anaerobic energy. But that tells us just a little bit of the profile on the athlete. That gives us kind of enough for creating kind of, I guess, effective training zones, so we know where those changes in energy systems happen. But we can also use that to define, right, what do we do the next test at, so which is more useful for what we're doing, which is 5 times 4 minutes, and we want to basically do it between the green and these orange line here. So that's going to be 4 minutes for this runner at starting at 6 minutes per k, 6 minutes per k, 5:27, 5, 4:37, 4:17. So that's basically between 10k an hour and 14k an hour. And then from that, what we get is this graph, which is effectively looking at the intensity. So if we know VO2 max sets the kind of capacity of aerobic work, the percentage of that is effectively how hard we're working. So we're measuring this more on how much of our maximum are we using. So we generally look at recovery, easy pace miles, like really easy miles, or very long kind of duration runs are generally done somewhere between 50 and 60% of VO2 max. Marathon pace, which I'd say is the low range, or for kind of slower runners, is somewhere between 60 and 70, or slightly longer ultras, like 50Ks. It's a good target for kind of stronger runners. And then you've got 70 to 80% is the kind of upper end for marathon intensity, and for kind of majority of runners it's somewhere close to kind of half marathon intensity. Now I'd say 80% tends to be about the ceiling for marathon intensity. You don't see many runners capable of running even 2 hours at kind of 80%. So I would say for most runners, and even for this runner in particular, like 80% would be, I'd expect them to run probably a half, somewhere between 5 and 4:36. So they'll probably run a 4:40, 4:45 is probably what they could run for a half marathon, maybe a little bit quicker, but from that. So yeah, 70 to 80% is what I would say for most good club runners, so that would, or elite club runners even, is, you know, sub 3 would be sort of maybe 70-75%. 230 is maybe pushing up towards 77-76%, and then sort of up below 3 you're looking at maybe 70%. 330 is probably 65-70% from that. 4 hours is probably closer to 60%. And then 10k pace is generally somewhere kind of close to about 90% of kind of VO2 max. So for this particular runner, it ties in with where we've got that anaerobic threshold, so they're about kind of 89-88% there. And then 5k pace is 90 to 100%. Again, 3k pace, people speak about being intensity of VO2 max. It's probably slightly below VO2 max. It's probably in that kind of high 90s. And then obviously 1500-800 meters is not just necessarily defined by VO2 max, because it's anaerobic work as well. So what we get from this is just basically showing where that intensity hits. So we're looking at where does 5 minutes k pace sit for this runner, and it's around about 75% of VO2 max. So I'm starting to question already now, can this runner run a 330, or is that intensity going to be a little bit too hard? And I suspect, based on the current data, that yeah, I would say a 330 is probably a little bit stretched target based on current fitness. And basically what this does is we look at then the low range, so the low range 60%, say the high range of 72% of VO2 max, and then the oxygen required needs to be somewhere in this kind of range here, which tells us running economy, which I'll show you in a second how we get running economy. But we're looking to see this runner is running economy fall between these two bars. So we're looking for oxygen uptake of somewhere between 32 and 40 milliliters of oxygen, and we need running economy to be somewhere between 170 and 200. So running economy on this graph is the amount of oxygen needed to cover a kilometer. So it's effectively the kind of miles per gallon that we'd equate to in cars. So it's how much oxygen you need to cover a distance. So we usually use a kilometer. So what you tend to see with most runners is that running economy doesn't really change as speed changes, certainly if it's between two thresholds. But what you see here, so at 6 minutes per k it's 210, and even at kind of 4:17 it's still 210. So it doesn't really drift that much, because as you're running faster you need more oxygen, but you're covering the kilometer in less time, which means the total oxygen needed to cover that kilometer will be fairly similar. So this particular runner has kind of not bad running economy. It's sort of better than average, not quite good. It's sitting in that kind of border between good being 180 to sort of up to 210, but their running economy is not terrible by any means. It's okay. But how does that look when we look back at that last graph where we plot it here? So that running economy of 210, this runner needs about 42 milliliters of oxygen to run 5 minutes per k, so run that 330 marathon pace. So I'd be saying, yeah, that marathon pace is probably a little bit ambitious. You'd probably be more likely to see them run probably slightly slower. They're probably more likely to run, I would say, based on their current fitness, 340, 345 is probably more attainable. Now, what I would say with most people is you want to know this before the marathon, because it can help you influence your training, rather than go 4 weeks before, find out that marathon intensity is that a little bit too hard. Because for most runners, running slightly faster than marathon pace for your training miles up to 20 miles is probably not a limiter. You're probably going to do it. It might start to get hard on that back end, but because you can run it for 2 hours, you can probably run it say 75-80% for 2 hours, but you don't know that until you get to the marathon and realize, oh, that last 40 minutes, that last hour, things start to unravel because you've been working at slightly too high an intensity. So you want to know that up front before you start your training, to know, right, what do I need to do to improve? Right, I need to work on bringing that down first before it becomes attainable, or change the goals. Now I think when we get 4 weeks out from a marathon, you're not going to change your goals. You're going to usually go in a bit pig-headed and tend to go, right, yeah, I'm going to just try and do it and hope it works out. And 9 times out of 10 it probably doesn't. You're probably going to unravel at 20 miles marks. The other thing we get from this, which is quite interesting, is fueling requirements. It's obviously quite important to fuel well for the marathon. So this looks at how much grams of carbohydrate, effectively how much glycogen is depleting at that given pace. So this is at 5 minutes per k for this runner, 330 pace. What happens if they get kind of fueling at the first one here is effectively no fueling, not taking on any carbs at all. This is fueling with 40 grams, 60 grams, 80 grams. And this red line at 150 grams of glycogen, this is stored glycogen in grams on the left hand side here. When you get to that point, that's what we call the danger zone. That's where you're going to start to mentally struggle. You're going to start to, the body's going to start to slow you down. You're going to start to feel a little bit hollow. We've all had those feelings. Just when you know you're starting to run a little bit empty, the tank's kind of running dry. When you get to that kind of point, that's where those things are going to be more magnified. The exact point is going to differ day to day, week to week, month to month. If you're well fueled, obviously it can take a bit longer because you've got more glycogen stored. So maybe you start with 350, 400. 300 is a good gauge for just the average person, certainly for a runner of 65 kilos. Female is probably not a million miles away. What they're stored in the muscles is stored glycogen, provided they're well fueled. But if they don't eat anything or don't take on any carbohydrates during their training and during their race, you're probably going to get to an hour and a half and the wheels are going to fall off, or pretty close to that. Not going to be fun. Probably don't want to do that. What happens if they go with 40 grams, which is roughly 2 gels per hour, which for probably a lot of females is probably what they would train with. And what we would see here is they're going to get to about 3 hours and they're going to probably then start to unravel, which is a problem if you've still got kind of a half hour to run. It's probably more likely you're going to blow up and you're going to finish in that sort of 345, 350, maybe even blow to pieces and end up being 4 hours, which is not what you want to do. But one of the things you'd find with this is if you're eating 40 grams in your training, if you're doing a 20-mile training run at 5 minutes per K, that's going to take you about 2.5 hours. You're probably going to be fine. You won't know that you're running low in glycogen. You're probably more likely to see that you'll get ill or injured in some of those longer runs, and I think that's what happens with a lot of runners. They miss training because they're not fueling well between runs, during runs, and if they're burning quite a lot of carbohydrates, they don't replenish between sessions, and then over a week their immune system's depleted, and then that fundamentally is the thing that sometimes trips their training up, and they go into the race without doing the training that they wanted to do. So I think knowing this, I'd be saying to someone who's this is you need to start introducing more carbohydrates. And I would be saying for this runner, just for 3:30 marathon base, excluding the physiology data, we want to be eating probably 60 grams per hour, because that's going to get you at least 4.5 hours before glycogen starts to be a problem, or glycogen depletion becomes a problem. So you want to test that. You want to be experimenting with 60 grams per hour. Sometimes even going a little bit higher allows you to run a little bit faster, but you want to test that. Can you digest 60 grams, or do you start to struggle from that? So certainly for this runner, if they're going to run a 3:30 marathon, excluding fitness, they need to be eating 60 grams per hour, or it's probably not going to end well. But ultimately, what does all this data tell us? Which I guess is, how do we put that into kind of practice? What does it tell us? What do we need to do? So the first thing we see with this runner, I said at the start, they've got a very strong aerobic capacity. The high VO2 max is good. It's definitely not a limiter for achieving the marathon. Now, if it goes up, obviously you can then potentially run faster, but based on where everything else is, it's definitely not a limiter per se. It's something that I would say this runner doesn't necessarily need to improve too much. If it improves, it's more of a byproduct rather than being an innate focus. We can probably improve this athlete's anaerobic threshold by about 5 to 10%. So getting the anaerobic threshold closer to 90% of VO2 max should be doable. The good thing with anaerobic threshold, it can improve over a relatively short time span, sort of 12 weeks. You can see good improvements with that. This will improve their 5k, 10k and half marathon pace. So if they can get better by improving the anaerobic threshold, they lift their 5k, 10k half marathon pace. That also helps improve them across every duration. But obviously running, they could probably get to the point where they could run 40 minutes or sub 40 minutes for 10k. They've got a relatively low aerobic threshold, so kind of, I thought it was 66%. It's not bad. Compared to where their capacity is, it's definitely something that I would say they want to improve and could improve, and it's probably the key to improve. They've got relatively good running economy. They're reasonably good at converting oxygen to kind of fuel. It's not bad. Could still be better. Is slightly a limiter, as we've seen there. We definitely would like to see it decrease based on the other data, but it could still definitely be improved. Key thing stands out here is their marathon pace is 74% of VO2 max. Probably too high for the duration of the run. If it was a 2:30 marathon at that intensity, probably fine, but 3:30 marathon at 74% is probably going to be pushing the boat a little bit too hard. So it's probably going to be a limiter. Said might there, but I would say for most people it is probably going to be a limiter. And they have a high dependency on carbohydrates at their target pace. 60 grams per hour should be maintainable for most people with some practice, but reducing it's definitely going to help them. So the key question is, what can they do to improve their chance of going sub 3:30 in London, which was the target race. So they've got 6 months to do it, plenty of time to improve. Now they know what their athlete looks like, what they need to then think about. The priority for them is improving the aerobic system. They want to improve the body's ability to use oxygen more effectively. So that's lifting the aerobic threshold, that's reducing the amount of oxygen needed to run at those kind of paces between sort of 6 minutes per K and 4:17 per K. So fortunately, the boring stuff is longer steady runs at aerobic threshold pace, 5:30 per K pace. So this runner doesn't want to push the pace too much initially. Now obviously you are going to need to do marathon pace development work, but initially I would say their long run should be slower than marathon pace. You want to be at 5:30 per K, because running 5 minutes per K is just a little bit too intensive for the benefit that they're trying to get from it. So you'll get more fatigued and get less benefit. Whereas if you slow that run down at 5:30 per K, it's going to be easier, you can maintain it longer, the body's going to adapt to that, because the aerobic threshold, the aerobic system improves mainly as a function of time more than it does the intensity. So longer and slightly slower is usually better, and it's doing it at the right intensity. Now you can obviously use heart rate to track that. Heart rate should stay stable at the aerobic threshold, and track that, does it drift over time? So if you do an hour, 2 hours run, do you see the heart rate gradually increase for the same steady pace? If it does, that's an indicator that you're kind of getting to the end of your aerobic endurance. You want to do more work of that. It's something called aerobic decoupling, and the less aerobic decoupling, the better for endurance. Also improving resistance to fatigue with threshold kind of work. Obviously there's a million different things you can do to improve kind of threshold. I think for this particular athlete I'd be saying doing longer, somewhat longer intervals, 8 minutes kind of or longer, aiming to run kind of close to threshold, so just below it. 4:20 pace is a good target. Aiming to get up to about 60 minutes of work. So that's, you might start with 4 times 8 minutes, or depending on where they start, what they've been doing, but 4 times 8 minutes, gradually extending that duration, trying to get to the point where you can maybe do something like 3:20s, 4:15s, even maybe 2:30s. Now it's a hard run, and that's the upper end of where you'd maybe want to get it to, but if you can develop that pace where you can hold 4:20 pace for an hour, your 5k, 10k and half marathon times are going to improve because of that. Without necessarily running that hard, it will get hard, but more fatigue rather than physically very hard, and you're not necessarily going to be, it's more your legs are going to give up for your body, so you're going to get the strength and the endurance from that. Longer intervals are usually better than faster. Most people, when they do threshold, they want to run faster, they're trying to push the pace too much. Now for this particular runner, they've got quite a good VO2 max, so running faster, they will be capable of it. They can probably do quite a lot of work faster, but it's not going to give them the same benefit. They're going to get more fatigue, injury risk goes up, might feel better to run faster, but the benefit's going to be probably going slightly slower. So slightly slower and longer will benefit them more. Experiment with higher carbs, so obviously work on taking in more carbohydrates. Can they do it? If not, they need to find a solution. But I guess worth with that is that can they take more than 60? But also, if they improve their aerobic system, so if they get better using oxygen, we would see that the amount of carbs that they need should decrease as well, because the body's getting better aerobically, which means it's going to then burn more fat for fuel from that. And obviously, as most people should be doing, I think, over the winter, is implementing some strength and conditioning. So you're getting stronger. That will also reduce muscle fatigue. That will improve overall strength. So running economy will improve through strength and conditioning. And then also building to things like plyometrics, which will reduce running economy because the tendons get stiffer. You get more rebound back from it, and you need then less energy. And we tend to see that will come back from you need less oxygen to run a given pace, which means the intensity which you're running at will also decrease. So it definitely has benefit, and it's definitely something that particular runner should do. Hopefully that was useful. From that, again, that's just a snapshot of one person's kind of data, and it's just kind of, I guess, showing that in terms of something that runner needs to do. And I think it's maybe try not to get caught up in what tends to happen with a lot of marathon training plans, is that if you're starting to push that intensity slightly too hard without realizing it, you might not know until 6 months later, until 2 weeks before the race, you get injured, or on the day, which is even worse, where you go bang on target at halfway and then unfortunately hit the wall, and or the legs just start to kind of crumble from that. And there's lots of things that need to happen as well for the marathon. Doing this isn't guaranteeing success, but I think knowing it up front before you start the training, you can start to work on improving the aerobic threshold, you can work on improving anaerobic threshold, you can experiment with higher carb intake, work on the strength and conditioning, reducing running economy or improving running economy, and ultimately becoming more efficient. And then from that, the 5 minutes per K becomes attainable, 3:30 is kind of achievable. And I think for this runner with their aerobic capacity, they should be capable of improving the aerobic system with a bit of work, and 3-hour marathon pace is probably attainable. So 3:30 is a target just now. They need a bit of work to get there, but continued working on the right thing, and they could probably take another 30-40 minutes off their current marathon time just by doing the right thing and progressing the physiology right. Yeah, any questions, feel free to give me a shout, and hopefully you found that interesting.